Welcome back to my channel, Star Booze.
Burke, Cardinal Raymond Leo, 76 years old, Wisconsin. Cardinal Raymond Burke, and vocal backer of Trump. He has been considered a head of the Church's conservative wing and has previously had a disagreement with Pope Francis. Cardinal Raymond Burke is not merely a name in the Church of Christ, he is the Pope. Francis did not wish to be present, a vicious, formerly a traditionalist and critic, but today he's back in the public eye following the Pope's moving on. Additionally, what he just disclosed has left people speechless. For many years, Burke argued with Francis on nearly everything: women's rights and LGBTQ rights. He always pushed back in the Church. He was even expelled by Francis from his flat in the Vatican. However, following Pope. Since Francis's passing, Burke has violated his quiet, and nobody believed what he anticipated. Come along as we examine thee. What were the remarks that rocked the faithful? They might indicate next. Beginning with early years of Cardinal Burke as a farm boy, Raymond Leo Burke had a lofty dream that was born in Richland on June 30th in 1948, Wisconsin's center. He was the youngest of 6 kids in a Catholic Irish home family. Thomas and Marie, his parents, Burke brought their children up in a peaceful dairy farm. Life was easy and faith was a regular component of the day. However, things was different when Raymond was in the 2nd grade. His dad was found to have brain cancer. As Thomas Burke's condition deteriorated, a local priest would frequently come to offer him communion. These visits had a profound effect on Raymond, young. He noticed something profound, strong in front of the priest, and the seed for his future was sown by it. Early on, Burke made the decision that he wanted to become a priest. At the age of 14, in 1962, he became a member of the Holy Cross at the age of La Crosse, Wisconsin Seminary. It was a significant milestone for a child, yet he was a devout follower. Burke later traveled from Wisconsin to attend America's Catholic University in philosophy was his field of study in Washington, D.C., and obtained a bachelor's degree as well as a master's degree. Then he went to Rome in order to further his education at their renowned Gregorian University in Pontifical. He lived there and pursued his theological studies at the North American College of Pontifical, a location where numerous aspiring bishops and cardinals received training. Actually, a few of Burke's fellow students later become senior church officials, such as Blas Kupik and James Harvey are cardinals. However, the most crucial moment arrived. He received his priestly ordination in 1975 at Pope Paul V's 6th Basilica, St. Peter's. A rural boys' day was filled with pride from Wisconsin, and only the start of a lengthy trip from the parish to the church priest to a leading Vatican attorney. Following his, Burke returned to La Crosse after being ordained. He was given the cathedral as his place of employment of the workman St. Joseph, and also taught religion at a high school in the area. However, his trajectory changed in 1980. To study canon, he was sent back to Rome. Law, the Catholic legal system church. Burke wasn't first thrilled regarding it. He was a little disoriented and lacking motivation. However, that was altered when an elderly priest saw how depressed he was and took him as a pupil. That assistance altered everything. Later, Burke claimed that he developed a fascination with canon law, finally obtained a Ph.D. and turned to become among the Church's leading authorities on the field. Upon his return to the United States, he assumed greater accountability. He turned into moderator of vice and curia chancellor for the La Crosse diocese. Pope John Paul II then awarded him in 1989 a significant part. Burke was designated as the initial the bond's American defender at the Innocence. Apostolic Signatura is the Church's top court. It was a large deal, demonstrating that Burke was more than a priest alone. He was an up-and-coming person in the legal community at the Vatican. As time went on, Burke's impact continued to expanding. 1995 saw him appointed Bishop of La Crosse's diocese, and in 2004 he was elevated to St. Louis Archbishop. While serving in these capacities, Burke established a reputation as a rigorous and leader who is conservative. He frequently spoke his opinions in support of traditional Catholic lessons and frequently commemorated the ancient Latin Mass. Burke's opinions were notable even in the presence of other bishops. He firmly upheld the marital principles of the Church, Eucharists, and abortion. He frequently said that lawmakers who backed abortion, such as Joe Biden or John Kerry, ought not to be given communion. This, he received support for his tough approach from Catholics who are conservative. However, it also caused controversy, the years of the Vatican, and a widening gap. In 2008, Pope Burke was summoned back to Rome by Benedict XVI. He appointed him as the prefect of the Apostolic Supreme Tribunal Signatura, the court where he previously worked in. After 2 years, Benedict made him a cardinal as well. This indicated Burke's greatest level of influence in the Church. He was well-liked, strong, and strongly associated with the conservative faction of the Vatican. However, when Francis, the Pope, things started to alter after the 2013 election. Francis and Burke had rather different opinions. Francis thought the Church required to be more hospitable and transparent. He announced a statement regarding homosexuals, "Who am I? Am I to pass judgment?" and even provided support for evolution, claiming that it didn't contradict faith. Burke disagreed. He opposed any attempts to make the Church's position on matters such as LGBTQ rights, rules for communion, or divorce. He felt that the Church should have firm. He stated in one interview, "We can never discuss abortion enough or union between a single guy and a single woman." Tensions swiftly increased. December 2013, Francis took Burke out of the bishop's congregation, an organization that aids the Pope in selecting new bishops. That was an obvious indication that they didn't agree. 14 was the last blow at a Vatican conference on family. According to the study, the Church should acknowledge some positive traits in gay connections. Burke was enraged. He stated, "There's a feeling that the Church without a rudder is like a ship." That saying quickly gained popularity and made headlines worldwide. Not long after, Burke was removed from his position by Pope Francis. Legal function. Rather, he provided him with a more symbolic role as the patron of the Malta's sovereign military organization. Francis claimed that this action wasn't penalty, but a lot of people thought otherwise, a spotlighted cardinal once more. Despite losing, his Vatican Burke's role did not diminish. He remained vocal. He continued to push back against what he perceived as harmful shifts in the Church, and he turned into the unofficial head of the conservative Catholics. Additionally, he kept making headlines. Over the past few years, he made strong declarations opposing the pandemic vaccinations as well as public health regulations. The Vatican, didn't agree with these beliefs or with a large number of Catholics who backed Pope Francis's strategy. In spite of their response, Burke remained steadfast in his convictions. He continued to be critical of the Pope's attempts to bring the Church up to date. He even stated at one time that there might eventually, when it would be required to make the Pope official corrections, a notion that many in the Catholic community were astonished by. The world. However, following Pope's death at 76, Francis and Burke are still active. People are observing him at the age of once more. Would he be the first? The Pope from America? He has undoubtedly supporters. Additionally, as one of the most prominent conservative opinions in the Church, he is probably a member of the Dialogue. Burke's transformation from a Wisconsin's tiny dairy farm to the Vatican's elite circles are full of, with passion, drama, and conflict. And with his most recent admission in public following, with Francis's passing, the attention has returned, and him as never before. What he divulged has left a lot of people stunned. When Burke was ignored by Pope Francis and Cardinal Raymond Burke encountered one in 2014, of the greatest setbacks to his career. Pope Francis took him out of almost all of his responsibilities, giving him just a ceremonial function. This took place following Burke attempted to dismiss a high-ranking officer for authorizing the condom purchase for Burmese citizens. It was an action that Pope wasn't in favor. Later, Francis sent someone else, a designated representative to the Order of Malta where Burke worked. Burke was reportedly deactivated. Officially, it wasn't a penalty, but evidently, he was no longer in command. It was yet another indication of how Francis and Burke had become distant. Burke and the Pope were at odds, but kept voicing opinions on a variety of topics. According to the Church, human sexuality is a treasured present. Taking considering his own human character, he frequently centered on issues within the Church. The issue involving child abuse was one of them. Burke was a harsh critic of clergymen, engaged in mistreatment, but rather than pointing solely at the people, he to deeper reasons. In 2015, he stated radical feminism was the true issue, which has attacked places of worship and society since the 1960s. After several years, Burke reaffirmed his opinions in 2019. In addition to German Cardinal Walter Brandmüller asserted that the primary cause, the plague, was the cause of the abuse crisis, of the agenda for homosexuality. As stated by Burke, numerous clergymen engaged in mistreatment were perplexed and feminized over their own sexual orientation. These claims generated a great deal of discussion, but they demonstrated his conviction that the Church had strayed from its customary origins, as well as his conflicts with the Pope weren't finished yet. Burke's public Pope Francis is being challenged. 2016 Cardinal Burke made an uncommon and audacious step. He openly contested Pope Francis and 3 other conservative cardinals. They sent official correspondence called a dubia, which is Latin for doubts. They asked excerpts from the Pope's text known as The Joy of Love is known as Amoris Laetitia. This, Francis's 260-page document, was one of his most significant works. In it, the Pope stated that the Church ought to be more hospitable and sympathetic. He concentrated on individuals who felt excluded, particularly those who were remarried after getting divorced. The Pope, no one can be condemned, the author stated, eternally. In accordance with Church rule, those who are not remarried without an annulment permitted to partake in communion. They were considered to be living in sin. However, Francis suggested a more gentle strategy. He proposed that choices might be made in privacy. Between the person and a priest, something would be used to do this, referred to as the internal forum. Burke, as well as there were other conservatives who disagreed. They desired precise responses. They thought the Pope's opinions led to confusion and misunderstanding. For this reason, they dispatched the dubia to inquire about Francis's clearly state your position. Typically, a pope can answer such inquiries with a document known as a reply. However, this Pope Francis did not reply at that moment. Everything. Burke refused to give up. Rather, he cautioned that in the event that the Pope did not respond, it would be necessary to take official action to rectify a serious mistake. He expressed his belief that even the Pope may be in error and required to be fixed. In 2018, he even more. As a matter of duty, he remarked, it is possible to disobey the Pope. Startled a lot of Catholics. Nobody anticipated a cardinal to express such strong opposition to the Church's leader. However, there was no way to remain silent, battling for the doctrine of the Church. Burke's Pope Francis's disputes didn't stop there. In 2019, yet another significant, there was a dispute, this time over the bishop's senate for the Pan-Amazoneria. Burke and a conservative companion, Athanasius Schneider, the bishop, released a lengthy argument against it. They stated, the Senate's agenda included some items that were not just in contradiction with regard to the genuine doctrine of the Church, even in opposition to it. Their largest, the Church's receptiveness to indigenous customs of the Amazon. Burke thought that this was an example of implicit pantheism. It gave too much, in his opinion, room for non-Christian views. Burke was displeased with additional aspects of the Senate. He was critical of married priests and expanding the position of women in the church rituals. He even made fun of girls acting as servers at the altar. Burke stated, "Young boys are unwilling to engage in activities with girls. It's just natural," he continued. "The creation of having girls serve at the altar boys become disinterested." He thought that the church was becoming very feminine. In his radical feminism that attacked society and the church since the 1960s has resulted in men being severely sidelined. Burke's opinions regarding same-sex unions were also firm. According to him, Catholics should never cast your ballot for the politicians who backed it. He asserted that there is just one location where these sorts of falsehoods, specifically from Satan. He referred to the increase in same-sex unions, ASA, devilish circumstance intended to destroy people, families, and the country. Burke adopted this tough posture as his trademark. Additionally, when Pope Francis urged, "Want a church that is more open and contemporary," Burke continued to push back with equal vigor. Force, conspiracy, controversy, and the pandemic. Following the outbreak, Burke discovered himself in the middle of another storm. He started to be among the loudest, the vaccine's detractors, particularly theones made from stem cells. He didn't believe them and alerted others not taking them. However, that wasn't everything. Burke reiterated the plot as well. Theories. According to him, the vaccination might be employed to exert control over others. He asserted it may include microchips and be a component of a government strategy to monitor individuals. He went on to say that it was all a part of a malevolent plan and connected it to the Great Reset is a conspiracy. These assertions were shown to be untrue. However, Burke maintained his opinions. Paradoxically, eventually developed a severe case of COVID himself. A ventilator was placed on him for and almost passed away after a week. However, he recovered and went back to being a public person. Another matter on which Burke remained steadfast was abortion. While Pope Francis and here opposed to it, Burke thought the Pope wasn't paying enough attention to it. He dialed us bishops should refuse communion to Catholic lawmakers who backed abortion rights, such as those of John Kerry as well as Joe Biden, the president. That's what he said. Failure to do so is undermining the trust of everyone. Additionally, Burke stayed faithful. To the Trident is an ancient Latin Mass. The Mass goes all out in this edition, back in time to the 1500s. It's sung in Latin and has extremely rigorous regulations, but Pope Francis made it in 2021 more difficult to use. He thought it had turned into a representation of opposition to change. Burke called these limitations in response harsh and transformative. He even asked whether the Pope was authorized to make such adjustments. Burke's customary made news once more. When he was spotted sporting a vintage cardinal, this is known as a gallerero. The picture went viral, swiftly, and others believed he was making an effort to revive antiquated traditions. However, Burke said that the hat was only a present, and he wore it for a picture once. I'm without. I have no idea where he obtained it. I've never, not even for a ceremony, he wore it, informed the media. Despite all of these confrontations, both men have stated that they don't see one another as adversaries. Pope in 2017 and Francis stated clearly that I don't see Cardinal Burke as an adversary. However, their distinctions were obvious. Accordingly, in late 2023, Pope Francis took a brave and important step, opposed to Cardinal Raymond Burke, Pope Cardinal Burke against Francis. Following, after years of conflict, the Pope chose Tormove. Two significant privileges that Burke possessed lasted for many years: his free apartment in Rome and his Vatican income per month of $5,000. These were not insignificant advantages. Burke stayed in a spacious Vatican apartment for free residence and was given a consistent salary, despite the fact that he frequently utilized Hisa Forum for criticizing the Pope. Why now, then? Everything followed Burke's most recent public censure of the Pope. In October 2023, Burke once more voiced, this time in opposition to too recently, Pope Francis had backed, permitting same-sex blessings from clerics' marriages and providing divorced people. With communion Catholics, Burke disagreed with either concept and made it apparent in the general public. Francis didn't remain quiet this time. He wrote a letter in response. Within it, priests, he clarified, could bestow partners of the same sex, but only if it didn't. Imply, that their relationship was identical, as a customary union between a man and a female. This was a significant step for the Church of Christ. It displayed Pope Francis was making an effort to be more forthcoming while retaining certain boundaries. However, to Burke, you went too far. Soon, the Pope then convened a meeting with leaders of the Vatican on November 20th, while it was determined during that conference that Burke had gone too far. They claimed he was making use of the Church's assistance to combat it. Thus, they took his apartment away from him and his allowance. At that time, Burke claimed he had no intention of leaving Rome. He said, journalists, that even if he was required to pay for, he would house himself there. Additionally, even despite the fact that the penalty appeared to be personal, I've never had the feeling the Pope considers me to be his adversary. However, the distinction between disagreement and betrayal had obviously been traversed. The gossip that caused more fire, following the Pope's rumors, spread along with the decision. One narrative written by a traditionalist, according to a Catholic news source, during Pope Francis at the meeting on November 20th, had declared that Cardinal Burke was my adversary, thus I'm evicting his apartment and stipend. That one phrase sparked an commotion. The Pope appeared irritated and individual. It also complemented the story that some traditionalist organizations frequently proliferate claims Pope Francis treats people unfairly and harshly, anybody who is against him. However, there was an issue. The statement was untrue. A reliable Vatican official is Austin Ivory, met with Pope Francis as a journalist on November 27th. Francis felt ill at the while afflicted with a lung illness, and they had a brief meeting. However, the Pope spent time elucidating what actually occurred. Ivory was informed by him that the news story was entirely made up, and never referred to Burke as his adversary. Additionally, he didn't mention my adversary either. Actually, the Pope stated unequivocally, I never used neither the pronoun my nor the term adversary. Francis claimed to have only told Vatican officials regarding Burke's removal privileges. He had not provided specifics or launched any personal assaults. The quotation had been fabricated and probably leaked by a candidate seeking the position of Pope appear awful. The erroneous quotation has already been extensively disseminated, although some individuals who were present in the room in November spoke with media during the 20th meeting and verified the reality. An official stated, according to the Associated Press, the Pope was taking away Burke's privileges due to the fact that he was a cause of division within the Church. Reuters was informed by another that Burke was acting in opposition to the Church and the Pope. They all denied that the Pope used enemy. Additionally, the Pope demonstrated that his behavior was not founded on subjective sentiments, but on what he thought to be ideal for the Church. Burke's perspective, despite facing penalty, Cardinal Burke never expressed regret for what he had said. rather outlined the reasons behind his speech. In a Burke's interview with the New York Times stated that it was obvious the Pope didn't want him in any position of authority. He acknowledged, "The Pope obviously doesn't want me in a position of leadership, but he denied being an adversary." Burke clarified his behavior by claiming to have an obligation. When he noticed what he thought were detrimental paths inside the Church, particularly on family and sexuality, he thought he had to say something. "Two had a responsibility to speak up," I said. Throughout the years, Burke had frequently positioned himself as an advocate for custom. He frequently opposed the modifications made by Pope Francis. From communion to same-sex blessings, for Burke thought divorced Catholics thought these actions that were undermining the Church's foundations. He believed that a shift should not come at the expense of enduring lessons. Everything was shaped by that belief. Burke did as he said. However, as he asserted, to express his conscience, his deeds frequently led to divisiveness. For a lot of people, inside the Church, that split turned into two a lot. Despite his self-defense, Burke made an effort to separate his name from other problematic individuals. Among them was Steve Bannon, Donald Trump's former advisor. Trump. Burke has previously been a member of the Bannon's Catholic Training Board, the Dignitatis Humania Institute, an organization. However, in 2019, he left the company. The explanation was that Bannon intended to turn the book into a movie in the Vatican closet. Burke didn't back that initiative. He clarified that he only had 3 or 4 encounters with Bannon, and just to discuss what the Church teaches, the same way a priest would interact with a member or lay believers. "I wanted it known," he stated, that he had no affiliation with any pivotal moment in a political campaign years in the making. For many years, individuals, the Church's exterior and interior had pondered when Pope Francis would eventually take action. Cardinal Burke had opposed the teachings of the Pope repeatedly. He's been critical of church services. He had written messages to the public and even alluded to. The Pope was formally corrected. However, Francis had let him remain. He'd not expelled him from the University of Cardinals. His home had not been taken away by him or his earnings thus far. Ivory Austin expressed it most effectively when he wrote that Peoples. The response was hardly, "What did the Pope do?" This, instead, what took him so? How long? Ivory claims that Pope Francis is a guy of patience. He puts others' needs second to opportunities. However, there is a limit, and Burke crossed it. Francis had observed Burke for more than 10 years. He had saw him talk on stage, compose compositions, and provide interviews in which the Pope's message. Burke had produced what some referred to as a counter-magisterium, a type of an alternative to the Pope's voice. And everything all that time, he had been residing in a Vatican monies were used to pay for the residence. This seems unjust to many. This was using his position at the Vatican. A wealthy cardinalto opposed the leadership that he'd vowed to follow orders. A single Vatican observer deemed it unfair, particularly when Burke's popularity among Christian conservatives by portraying himself as the sole authentic voice of custom. However, despite everything, Pope Francis didn't act angry yet. He created the quietly, make a choice. He kept it a secret. In the open, the information was released only after it was probably leaked by someone who wished to embellish the tale. In the Pope, Francis clarified at the end that this was not about getting even. It concerned preserving church unity. The Cardinal Burke's controversy, it might have at last peaked. And since the Pope's death, the emphasis has changed to the following: step for the Church and its leaders. What occurs when a Pope passes away? When a Pope passes away, the Catholic Church goes through a time for preparation and grieving. However, behind the scenes, the procedure starts. We refer to it as a conclave. The Church gets together at this time. cardinals from numerous countries to select the next pope. Cardinals only voters under the age of 80 are permitted or win an election. There are currently 138 qualified cardinals. They'll be confined to the Vatican for roughly 2 or 3 weeks. This is when they will meet within the Sistine Chapel, in secret. They will repeatedly cast their votes there until at least 2/3 of the votes and accepts the position of church leader. Pope Francis was selected in this manner in 2013 following the resignation of Pope Benedict XVI because of poor health. It was the initial 600-year papal resignation. Now, following Pope Francis's passing on Easter Monday, the 88-year-old, the Church is getting ready to choose a new leader once more. Additionally, one name drawing, Cardinal Raymond, is receiving major attention. Burke, Cardinal Raymond Burke, you see, is not brand new to the public eye. He is 76 years old, aged, and hailing from Wisconsin, USA. He has been well known for many years for his strong conservative convictions and a firm objection to the modifications made by Francis the Pope. Among them are gentler strategies for LGBTQ rights and providing communion to Catholics who have divorced. Burke once served as the Archbishop of St. Louis. Pope Benedict XVI subsequently named him a prefect after bringing him to Rome. Of the highest authority, the apostolic signatura, the Catholic Church's court. However, when Pope Francis took over, things altered. Francis took Burke out of the influential group of bishops in 2013. The year after that, he was also expelled from the highest court of the Church. Burke frequently criticized the Pope's concepts, particularly those that created the Church appear more welcoming and open. Now, as a fresh conclave draws near, Burke's name is now back on the news reports, and he has an unexpected Trump's fan. What comes next for Cardinal Burke? Burke is not alone. Candidate. He is one of several names being taken into account, and they originate from several facets of the Church. A few are progressives. Others, such as Burke, are more conventional. Other leading candidates include the moderate Cardinal Proin, who's been the Secretary of the Vatican State. Cardinal Matteo Zuppi is another, who is renowned for his humanitarian efforts. This is thought to be similar to Francis's beliefs. Luis Antonio Tagle, a cardinal from the Philippines, is included as well. Additionally, there is Cardinal on the conservative side, Hungary's Peter Erdo, who shares some of Burke's opinions but is not as vocal. At the moment, Burke is rated 6th among the leaders. However, what makes him notable is the political backing he's received. Obtaining. Trump, who is currently in his second, has commended Burke throughout his time as U.S. President as someone who upholds conventional Catholic principles. This type of political support is not common in church affairs, and it has generated discussion.